Megan, good morning.
Jeff, good morning. Thanks for
How are
having
you?
me.
So, yes, we're unscripted, no prep. So I apologize if that scares you, but I don't think it does.
We are
Uh,
literally without a roadmap right now. It's great. I'm
Perfect.
excited.
Well, that's a good segue. I wanted to ask you about the maps. What you've got maps in your background, and our good friend Ted Wang told me that's a real passion of yours. What spurred that?
Yeah, I can give you like the quick laptop tilt to check out a portion of my collection.
Wow.
I am indeed a fanatical map collector. It started when I was younger. My family always traveled a lot. So, that spurred an interest in other places for me. And then I was really attracted to maps, in college and coming out of college, because to me, they are the perfect intersection of art and utility. They've been
Yep.
used for hundreds and hundreds of years as a true tool for people to find their way, navigate their way around the world. But at the same time, I just think they're so cool looking. I think they're beautiful. And they've been treated like art as well throughout history. So I've always really loved maps. I'm not snobby about them. You can see there's one over my shoulder that's just a run-of-the-mill kind of touristy poster of San Francisco. And the one above it is actually one of my more famous ones. It's Captain Cook's Journeys. It's
Wow.
very old.
Is there a favorite? Is there one that's like
I
near and
don't
dear to your heart?
I don't have a specific favorite one. There's one right over my shoulder here that's a little bit too much glare, I think. It is Hong Kong in the 1930s, which is
Oh,
kind of,
wow.
but yes. And so that honestly, it inspired a lot of my professional career as well. So my first job coming out of Stanford was at Google early on as part of the acquisition team, helping acquire a company called Keyhole that turned into Google Maps and Google Earth.
Yeah, that was a good one.
That worked out for the company, but for the duration of my time at Google, 8 years or so, I worked on maps in some capacity, and to some extent, I'm working on maps again now at Niantic.
Yeah, I want to get into that. Okay, so you went from Google, and then did you go straight into venture from there, or did you go somewhere? Walk us through the history.
No, I was at Google for about 8 years in various capacities across marketing, business development, and finally landing in product, where I led our effort to build our own maps from scratch, get off of third-party data providers. And that's what Google, continues to do today. And then after 8 years, Jeff, I started having these reoccurring nightmares that I was going to be, 60 years old and still at Google, and, the SVP of something. I mean, this is not a hardcore.
Couldn't be bad.
I was about to say it's not a hardcore nightmare, but I left college halfway through my senior year to join Google, so it was kind of felt like an extension of college. There had never been a really specific transition between education and work. And so I loved Google, but I kind of forced myself to leave. And specifically, I forced myself to find the 180 experience. So I wanted to go someplace that was small. I mean, when I joined Google, it's about 1,000 people. So It was really a startup. It was before the IPO, but not really a startup. I wanted to go someplace that was design driven. I had only ever met one designer in my entire time at Google. It was very engineering focused culture.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go to some place, ironic as it sounds, it was a bit of a cult of a personality. Larry and Sergey very early on pushed decision-making to the edges. You had 20% time, they were hands-on and they certainly had a point of view, but they really pushed decision-making to the edges and stepped back. And so I really was looking for something that would give me that opposite experience. And I met Keith Herboy, who had recently joined Square as COO, someone you and I know as well.
Yeah.
He ended up, recruiting me and then, spent time with Jack over to Square. So I joined Square around the 20th employee or so as the head of product and was there for a couple of years.
Wow, what an awesome ride. Yeah, I remember we went in and met, I'll never forget, we went in and met with Jack and Keith. It was like 2009 or 10. And one of our partners from Asia, Thomas, who's one of the founders of our firm, I remember he asked Jack this question. He said, "So Jack, you're trying to replace point of sale. I mean, point of sale has been around forever. It's a boring industry. How is that? Why is that exciting?" And Jack looked at him. He said, "I'm not replacing point of sale. I'm replacing cash." And it was like everybody was silent for a minute. And Thomas was like, "That's a big idea." And we left the meeting. And by the way, Thomas was an early investor in Alibaba Group and on the board of Alibaba when it was a $10 million company. He actually knew Jack before he even started the company. I'll never forget, we left the room. He said, "We should put as much money in that company as we can." was
Yeah,
pretty
that
cool.
really was the maniacal focus for us, at least at the start, was the 8 million small businesses in the United States that didn't accept credit cards. Like we were
Yeah.
not competing, trying to edge the legacy POSs, literally POSs, off the counter just yet. It was more about focus on this core, this group of merchants who've been locked out of the credit card accepting economy, and then start to move up the ladder, start to kind of edge our way onto the counter and gently shove the existing legacy providers.
And
Um,
what years were you at Square?
I joined Square in 2000, beginning of 2012, 2011, 2012. Oh, time is a flat circle, Jeff. So I think it was 2012. And then I left about halfway through 2013. I think I joined at the end of 2011 and
Yeah. And
halfway
what were your big takeaways from that experience? Having gone from Google to Square, I mean, by the way, two of the greatest tech companies in the history of Silicon Valley, in my opinion, but like, what was your big takeaway from that Square experience?
just the fact that design can be a competitive advantage. It's something that we debated, as an investor. When I then moved on to the investing side, there's people who absolutely believe it can't be, and Square really instilled in me a belief that it can be, if absolutely flawlessly executed. And that maniacal focus on design, was completely different than my experience had been at Square. I think, the challenges and opportunities of scaling a company at that stage, when I started, it was about 20 people. When I left, it was about 450 people. It was just massive growth.
Yeah.
And, the hurdles that we ran into that then helped me as an investor later on, in terms of advising other companies, was another big takeaway. And just the focus on, starting small, but on a very big journey. Like Jack would talk about even then, we want to craft the span of a payment. We want to be both on the payment accepting side as well as the payer side. I mean, this is long before Square Cash. This is long before the card. This is long before, all the things that we now have in the market. That huge vision was always there, but there was a very clear focus on starting small, starting with the 8 million SMBs that didn't accept credit cards as a step towards crafting that whole span. So those were a couple of the things. It was a really formative experience for me. I worked incredibly hard. I was doing 18, 19-hour days. It was an awesome experience.
And such an amazing, I mean, Square folks have gone on to do Open Door, and I mean, it's incredible how that company, I think, is going to, well, anyway, spawn a ton of innovation. But one question there is, and maybe this sort of leads into venture and what you're doing now, but like Jack's also well known for being somebody who has a lot of ideas. And, there was the Starbucks thing, there was Square Wallet, obviously Square Cash has now been successful, but how did you guys balance that, entrepreneurial mindset of, something we always deal with in the venture world, where a great founder comes in and says, I've got these 5 other things we need to be doing right now. And the team kind of groans and goes, we can't do all those. How did you balance that at Square? And what advice did you give to people as an investor? And how do you incorporate that into your universe today, where I'm sure there's a million things you guys could be doing and you've got to prioritize and decide?
It's a great question. And it's a timeless question, because I don't think there is one true solve. And I'll tell you, being the head of product at a company with such a product visionary like Jack is a very unique experience. Not to be too tactical, one of the things that we did that, I now have brought over to the Niantic team is that for some of those efforts, we actually would execute a small tiger team. We would have a red team or tiger team, different companies call them different things. They would literally sit in a conference room together. It was 4 to 6 people, full stack, really hammering away on an opportunity. Some examples of that include the Square Wallet initially. We had the Square taxi cab experience for New York City taxis. There were a couple of other things like that. They were all strings worth pulling because distribution was sort of the name of the game for us at that point in time. And you can imagine if you're in every taxi cab in New York City, even if the transaction sizes are small, the brand awareness, the distribution is remarkable. Certainly Square Wallet was the precursor to Square Cash. It was a little bit too early, but it was about crafting that whole payment experience. And, Jack had another, dozen or so ideas on top of that. But a few of them, we were able to really focus a small team on, go execute very, very quickly. You have limited budget, limited headcount, limited time. see what's possible, and then we would make a decision about whether or not to continue to invest. And we do something very similar today at Niantic, where we have this concept of bold bets, which are a couple of very small efforts. They're not so far afield from our business that, you know, someone would be like, why are you doing that? Or that doesn't make
Right.
they're really adjacent to the product, or they're adjacent to our market. And they're things that we just want to put a small amount of focus, time, and team on and see what's possible, whether before we decide to double down and really, you know, fully build out a team to support and continue to innovate.
So you have this amazing time at Square, and then you decide to get into venture capital. Talk about that. What brought you to Spark, and how did you, I don't know, what caused you to jump into that side? And then I want to obviously get into what you learned while there, and but what brought you into venture from Square?
So I had never thought about venture capital at all. No offense, but I thought that venture capital was only for
Most
older
people shouldn't. It's
white
not that exciting, honestly.
and I didn't think it, you know, I was the right fit for it. But you know, the folks at Kleiner reached out, and I had known Mary from my experience at Square. I had known John from my experience at Google. I liked them both. I had really good relationships with both of them. And when we started talking about it, the opportunity to get a horizontal view across industries, products, business models, entrepreneurs, you name it, was incredibly tantalizing. You know, I had been so focused on maps and so focused on payments, and essentially lived in a bubble where nothing else had ever happened, you know, for my first 10, 12 years working. And so the idea that, wow, you know, you can experience and learn about all sorts of different industries was really awesome. And I do think if you're someone who's intellectually curious, the context switching of venture capital is just unbelievable. Like that's that's the best.
I always describe it to people as like, you know, when you're driving down the road and you see a dog with their head out the window, that's what it's like. Like they're, you know, all the sense that's driving the dog crazy. That's sort of what happens in venture.
Yeah, I mean, you go for a meeting that, you know, oh, it's a
Yeah.
makeup company, to a robotics company. Oh, now we're at an enterprise SaaS company, you know. And so anyway, I joined Kleiner. I was at Kleiner for about 4 years. I was split between the early stage team and the growth team. Worked on a lot of different investments there, had a really good time. It was obviously a firm in transition then. It's, you know, certainly I think come out of that transition. But you know, towards the end of that tenure, I moved to London with my husband, who is also an investor. And when I moved back from London with him, he was there for a year getting what was Google Ventures off the ground. It felt like an opportunity to potentially do something new. You know, I was changing locations. We got married, you know, literally that same time. And I had been chatting with the folks at Spark. I had known Bijan primarily for years, Kevin Thau a bit, and they were just getting a growth fund off the ground. And my partner, Jeremy Phillips, was leading that effort. And the team was very small. It was 3 people. And, you know, they said, look, you've got experience on both sides, but come and help us build out this growth practice. You know, they just kind of closed on fund 1, then 1 or 2 investments. And I was really excited about the opportunity to craft a completely new team, new fund, new way of doing investing, certainly new way of doing investing at the growth stage. And so I ended up moving over to Spark, and you know, was there for another 4 or so years.
Yeah. So 8 years in venture.
I think 9 years in venture.
9 years of venture. And having been, you know, a successful operator at Google and then Square, and now you're at what are some of the big takeaways that you would have for entrepreneurs who are building companies, you know, from that time at KP and Spark that you share with, and obviously you're sharing it with your team today. Like, what are the main, and you and I really got to know each other through Handshake working with Garrett, but like, what are some of the main, because I personally think having operating experience is super valuable as an investor. I think it just makes you much more empathetic to the day-to-day up and downs of actually building a company. And there's like no right answers, and it's a journey. But like, I'd just love to hear some of the things you feel like you've shared over and over that are sort of timeless pieces of advice that you've given entrepreneurs and CEOs along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm still actually on all my Spark boards, unbelievably. So I still have an opportunity, even outside of Niantic, to work with entrepreneurs, which I find valuable. The first and foremost is really around company scaling, and this idea that your communication tools, your mechanisms for communicating break every 30 people. I have this concept of every 30 people.
Wow.
And, obviously when you're going through hyperscale, you're flipping through those 30, markers pretty quickly. And so my advice and guidance to entrepreneurs is to actually overinvest in process and tooling and communication rigor much earlier than you think you need it. Even if it kind of bristles some folks because, oh, process, that sounds like a big company thing and we're starting up. Well, the point is we don't have process. I will tell you, not having a process is a process unto itself. It's just a different one. And I promise by the time you get good at it and comfortable with it, you're going to need to change it all over again. So I really spend time focused, with entrepreneurs and at Niantic on establishing really clean, thorough mechanisms for sharing information, making decisions, sharing the why of those decisions. And that is definitely something that came out of both of the scaled experiences I saw, Google from 1,000 to 35,000 people, and then Square from 20 to 400 or so.
That, increments of 30 is kind of crazy, right? You think of most people think of it as like, okay, Series A, Series B, and in that time you might go from 30 people to 200. Yep. I think the other thing that's interesting about that is a lot of entrepreneurs, because they understand the vision in their head so well, they don't realize that everybody else doesn't get it, right? And particularly, people in sales and marketing often get it because they're telling that story every single day. This is more enterprise than consumer, but engineering and other parts of the organization are sort of along for the ride and many steps behind. And so it's when we see companies hire a VP of people or a head of people, it's one of the first things they dive in on. They say to the founder, hey, look, I know you have a great idea of where we're going, but the other 400 people in this company don't. Yep. And obviously that must have been at an extreme level working with someone like Jack, who is such a, one of the great all-time visionaries of our time.
Yes, I mean, it's the classic expression, repetition doesn't spoil a prayer. We tell our entire executive team, we need to repeat our mission. We need to repeat our roadmap. We need to repeat our North Stars and the waypoint to our North Star constantly, to the point where it feels awkward because we're saying it so much and we're using the same terminology so much. And only once then that you feel like, oh, people are going to hate this because I've said this many times, does it really start to, I think, infiltrate the system. And, that is something I learned from Jack, particularly around decision making, because you go from a dynamic where everyone's in the room for the decision and everyone has a point of view and is sharing it. And of course, in that rule of 30, that quickly dissipates. And you have to decide, how are we going to make decisions and who's going to make the decision and who are we going to, seek counsel from versus who is the end person actually decides. And Jack was always focused on the why. Like, we can make the decision, you can make the decision. That doesn't matter so much as understanding the why of what the decision is and making sure that that is really clear to the organization. And so even at Niantic now, we're a company of 650 people. We're incredibly mature in a lot of ways. But we still, as a leadership team, spend time thinking about how can we scale, the why piece of each of these decisions that we're making, such that everyone in the organization understands. Even if they don't agree, they understand where it came from. And that's, again, not something that I think is going to change. I think as we continue to scale, that's going to continue to be a challenge that we need to adapt with.
And I want to ask you about Niantic, but before I do, so you had the time at KP and the time at Spark. Is there a company that you saw along the way that you didn't get to invest in that you wish you would have, that just you look back and say, man, what an opportunity? Because we have a lot of those.
So, the anti-portfolio, the famous anti-portfolio.
Yeah, but just something you got close to and it just didn't happen for whatever reason and has gone on to be just an epic, because we have tons of them. But I always tell people, that's one of the hardest things about venture that you don't realize from the outside is you see these people are always like, oh, amazing. You guys have had all these IPOs and all this success. I'm like, yeah. And we also passed on X and Y and Z, and we just got it wrong. And as much as I love those founders later on in life and I'm rooting for them, it just pains me that we missed an opportunity to invest with them.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's many of them. In fact, I think to your point about one of the things people don't understand about venture capital, I think people think it's relatively easy. And I will tell you, I am here to tell you, as you know, that I will back you up. It is not easy. You're wrong more than you are right. That's the nature of venture capital. I have a very obvious one, which was when I was at Kleiner, I invested in Stripe. I had known the Collison brothers from my time at school. We chatted with them early on. And it was out of our growth funds. It was a healthy valuation at that point in time. And because of that relationship, I saw the $9 billion round again at Spark. And I was at that point, I was like, 9 billion, that's just like, we're trying to do venture growth, which in our head was kind of just post-inflection. We were looking at valuations, yeah, maybe around $1 billion or whatnot, but that 9 billion seemed, just a bit too far out of our mandate as a growth.
Yeah.
And now, if you believe what you read and you understand where it's trading and where it potentially will trade, it looks like a layup. You should have done that deal, 7 days out of 7. So I certainly am a big fan of that company, of the two brothers, and I'm really excited about what they're doing going forward. I'm happy I'm in it from one capacity, but I really screwed it up.
Yeah, amazing company. I wish we were in it. That's a painful one. I wish we were. To be fair, we never really got close, but that's an amazing company. So what brought you from Spark to Niantic? And maybe talk a little about that, and then I want to talk a little about the role and how you work with the founder and things like that. But what brought you from Spark to Niantic?
So the founder and CEO of Niantic is a man named John Hinkey, and he was my boss for most of my time at Google.
Oh,
and
wow.
At the end of my tenure at Google, he actually started what was called an autonomous unit within Google. It was something that they were doing to keep high-profile executives. They kind of said, go start a little startup within the company, your own budget, your own office, that type of thing. And he brought me along with him. It was about 3 or 4 of us when he went and did that, and that was Niantic. And we called it Niantic, and it was really about exploring what was possible with geolocation and maps, which Google had invested really heavily in, but outside of the areas where Google was naturally interested.
I'm sensing a trend here with the maps.
Yeah, catching on. How could we leverage this amazing asset that Google had invested in for things that were not search or wayfinding or kind of traditional Google-esque businesses? And it was really fun. I worked on that with him for about a year before moving on to Square. And I will tell you, even at Square, he went from being my boss to being my advisor. He would come and sit at Blue Bottle Coffee over in Mint Plaza with me every other Wednesday, and I would run through here's the challenges I'm having. Maybe it was something with Jack or the team, and he would give me advice. And then he decided to spin Niantic out of Google. And at that point, I was at Kleiner. So then the roles switched again, and I was advising him a bit about how would you put together that kind of deal? What would be required from a funding perspective, and how would that look? And then as he continued to build Niantic, and I was on the investing side, informally continued to advise him, and then finally convinced him to actually let me officially invest. So we led a Series B, is the largest check Spark's actually written in the company in 2017. Wow. And I joined the board at that period of time. So, was on the board for a long time. Again, obviously talking with John very frequently, as a board member, and saw the company go through this tremendous scale. I mean, the company hired, I think in the span of 12 or 18 months, the company hired 250 people.
Wow.
And he's a solo founder, CEO. And I was adamant, you need someone to take the weight off your shoulders. It can't all be on you. Let's get you a COO, someone who, can, work with you shoulder to shoulder on a day-to-day basis. And, he met a lot of folks, really awesome people. And I think he also started talking with other COOs in the industry about, what is the most important thing to have in a COO? And they all came back to trust. And, he and I had now a 20-year relationship as advising and bosses and, friends. And about a year ago, last fall, he asked if I would take the job. And I said no. I was an investor. I hadn't thought about going back into operating. I wasn't particularly interested in going back into operating. Mm-hmm. And I still had work to do. At Spark, I was a key man on the fund, and we had just raised a fund and all of this. And we continued to talk about it on and off for about another 6 months or so. And Spark's second growth fund closed. We were about to kick off our third fund. So that's when, as as a VC, you're signing up for another decade or whatnot. And I just felt like there was unfinished business. Like it felt like, I could go in, I could be helpful. I did have a unique sort of relationship with John, whereby I thought I could help him be successful as well as the company. And so I decided to do it. So I joined in the middle of April of this year. So about 4 to 6 weeks after, the pandemic really hit, and joined, remotely like everybody else, these days. And, we find ourselves here 8, 9 months later. So I'm the COO. I oversee our business operations, our business development, corporate development, legal, marketing, communications, customer operations, sales, and international teams.
And how did you guys map that out? So one of the things that I've seen quite a few companies where, like, I would argue Handshake, John Stahl, who's the COO there, has been a great partner to Garrett. I wish more of our companies could find that kind of partnership with a CEO and a COO along the way. How did you guys think about the relationship and the role, and who owned what? Did you figure that out before you joined or after, or how did that all, because that's always one of the things that comes up when you suggest this.
Yes, we worked on it for about, I would say 6 weeks or so before I actually joined. And we had a Google Doc. We still have a Google Doc. And it was, I came with a list of questions. Where can I be most valuable? What teams do you think need the most help, either hardening what exists or really standing them up for the first time? What are the things you enjoy doing? And what are, frankly, the things you don't enjoy doing? Because I do believe a lot of the role of the COO is to oversee things that the founder and CEO don't really want to spend time on, not where they think they're getting their most leverage. And so we had a Google Doc, and we went back and forth, asynchronously, about the areas of the business where he thought I could be helpful. And there were things, he wanted me to take on that, I went around and talked with a lot of folks. I got a lot of advice from some really excellent COOs, and they said, maybe take that on later, but start with this and, iterate. And so it was, I wouldn't call it a negotiation, because again, it was very friendly, and we're both interested in doing what's best for the company and all of the Niantics at the company. But it was a bit of back and forth in finding out what the right lanes were. And I will say, in all candor, even though we have very clear, lines of business that we each oversee, and reporting structures very clear, between the two of us, we are still on a day-to-day basis figuring out, okay, where do you end? Where do I begin? Where are the things that, are technically in my organization, but where you have really strong personal views that absolutely we need to ensure that we're incorporating early and regularly. And that's a really ongoing educational experience. It's not something I think that I will even have fully wrapped up and done in my first year. I think it's going to be, an ongoing give and take to understand where it is, I can best help John in the company, and, where he feels like he's, spending his time for, maximum benefit for employees and shareholders.
And let me, I know something that you've been involved in, All Raise and some other efforts around diversity. What are you guys doing at Niantic to make sure that you have a diverse company? This is also something that we've spent a lot of time on with a lot of our companies, and a lot of companies struggle with it. And I just love to hear, what you're doing and how you're thinking about it.
Yes, it's not easy, and there's no quick fix. So we have short-term requirements and long-term goals. So we have long-term goals around, the representation we want to see of women or people who identify as women, and underrepresented minorities of other groups, that we have shared with the company, going out 3 and 5 years. And then on a day-to-day basis, we're still very aggressively scaling. We have a D&I commitment requirement for every single hire, which is that a woman or underrepresented minority must make it to the second round. So we have 3 rounds of our traditional interview process, and be considered at that second round. And if that doesn't happen, John personally needs to approve. And that can, be all the way down to, an acquisition whereby we're going to suddenly be bringing on a bunch of people. So that's a little bit different type of an onboarding and recruiting experience. We've been fairly acquisitive and pretty successful with, all the way to, some of the things that we're doing in AR are so specific, that there's a handful of people in the world who are really building and understand from a research perspective. And even those types of hires, we really try and, focus the team on this D&I commitment, and understand that if we're not going to be able to meet that D&I commitment for an individual hire, why is that? And make sure John's aware of it.
Yeah, it sounds like one of the takeaways is you're very deliberate. I mean, that's one of the things I've seen with a lot of our companies in the last 12 months is they've just said, look, it's not going to happen organically. We need to be deliberate, and we need to be very conscious about what we're doing. And that's the only way it's going to change.
100%. The entire executive management team gets an email every Monday that details, where we're standing as a company in terms of that mix, as I mentioned at the top, and also the hires that came in last week, whether or not the D&I commitment was met, or if not, why that was.
Wow, that's cool.
It's in our email inboxes weekly.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the things we figured out over the last year, spending much time with portfolio companies, once you get to like 500 or 1,000 employees, if you haven't built some of those mechanisms in, it's really hard to change. It's just the culture of the company the culture's not diverse.
Yep, completely agree. And our player base, our explorers who use our applications, they're as diverse as they get. It's
right.
incredibly, international, all age groups, all ethnicities. It's important to us that, on the building side, to the greatest extent possible, we reflect those customers, because we're building new applications. We've said we're building 10 right now. We're with a plan to launch 2 a year. They are not going to all be like, Pokemon Go, which people mostly know. They're going to be, all sorts of different, even non-gaming experiences. And if we aren't sort of reflecting the player base that we have today, I'm not convinced necessarily that we would be able to build experiences that would really resonate. So that is, it's not just because it's the right thing to do. It's good for our business. It's good for our product development process.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, hey, we only booked a half an hour and we're at that time. I could spend a long time talking to you. Your experience across Google and Square and KP and Spark and Niantic is so cool. And thanks for sharing it with me. And thanks for all the things that you're doing on the board of Handshake and so many other great companies. And I'll be watching Niantic. I wish we were an investor.
Well, thank you. Yes, and we didn't even get the chance to talk about Handshake.
I know.
Just one of my very favorite.
I know. Garrett's really an amazing founder, and it's an amazing company. And you were early on that one. We were later on, but I'm so excited about the next few years at Handshake. I think it's gonna be really cool.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we're thrilled to have you on board. So thank you for having me so much, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Megan. Take care. Bye.
Bye.